Hello. Thank you so much, Tanisha. Thank you, Egypt. Thank you, everybody. And Valerie, congratulations.
Thank you.
And Jean, thank you so much. I am honored to be here. And even though it's probably the first time this has ever happened, actually it is the first time, I think, like you said, people can join from around the country. And in some ways that makes it a new but interesting way of engaging. I'm going to start by sharing my PowerPoint, and I'm a Socratic type professor, so I like to engage the audience. I'm not going to do that directly, but I am going to pose questions as I go along and invite people to reflect on what I'm saying, so that in the chat maybe and in the discussion at the end, we can have a little bit more back and forth rather than a monologue. I'm very much into dialogue, especially in terms of community building and recognizing that we are a collective. So did that share? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. All right. So yeah, so the title is this idea of my journey into community organizing, intellectual activism, and food justice. And as was stated, I have, with my wife, created a commercially licensed cooperative kitchen, but that's sort of further down the story. So I'm going to start what I do in class, which is a mini meditation. Oh, no, actually, before we get to the meditation, I also want to acknowledge and appreciate the AADC, the committee for inviting me to this unique opportunity, also for giving me an award and inducting me into the Society of Excellence. Truly an honor. I also want to recognize and appreciate Laura Zagoren and Barron. It was great to see you. I'm so happy that you're here. And also your mother, Adelaide Marcus Zagoren, and that, you know, she would have been somebody I would love to have met. And it's so wonderful, as you were saying, Valerie, of just how the legacy goes on, and you are carrying the torch, and we are collectively continuing this commitment to justice, to alumni, to feminism, to racial justice, and to community. And so also it's an honor to give this keynote during Women's History Month, and also for the kickoff of the countdown to your 100th anniversary. Pretty incredible when you think about it, 100 years of an organization. So much appreciated, very honored to be here. Okay, so in my classes, I like to start with what I refer to as a mini meditation. You can use whatever language you like, if it's mindfulness, contemplative practice. And this kind of fits nicely with what Egypt was saying in terms of the land acknowledgement. I think we need to take more time to recognize our gratitude, recognize our bodies, the land we are on, the stories that we are part of, recognize people who have enabled us to be where we are, and also at this time to recognize how lucky we are that we are able to have this event while some people are really suffering from the pandemic, recognizing those of you who might have lost loved ones, recognizing all of the struggles that we are conscious about, and many of us carry in our hearts. And so I like to invite students and yourselves and myself just to take a moment, and I'm even going to close my eyes if that's comfortable for you, and just allow yourself to take a nice deep breath of gratitude, of relaxation, of appreciation. And then, as my students like to say, kind of breathe in the positive and exhale that which does not serve us. So again, take a nice deep breath and exhale that which does not serve. Okay, so thank you for that. I want to start my story with a quote, or actually two quotes from Isabel Allende that have stuck with me over the years. And the first one, maybe you've all heard it: you are the storyteller of your own life. You can create your own legend or not. And as a sociologist, I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a moment in terms of the relationship between our stories and the social structures that create parts of those stories. But I also want to invite you, while you're listening to my story, to recognize that all of our stories matter. All of us have complexity, struggles, and that the collective that brings us and weaves us really makes us who we are. And so part of what I've done with this creation of a kitchen, along with my wife over the last 12 years, is tell the story. I, in the last 2 years, have written a book. And part of writing that book is kind of the second quote. This idea of writing is always giving some sort of order to the chaos of life. It organizes life and memory. And so kind of thinking about how we write and tell our stories, and those of us who are lucky to be able to tell our own stories, those of us whose stories are told for us, but not in a way that represents our story. And so part of this lecture is about who gets to tell our stories and who gets to own the knowledge that either we discover or that we know to be true. And so a lot of what we're going to be talking about is this concept of positionality that links to who we are and how we have been socially constructed. So from that, it's very important for me, and particularly as an alum of Douglas, to talk about education. The way I teach comes from a long history of theorists. And it's funny, in terms of how my story has evolved, the most influential person in my teaching history has been Bell Hooks, who I was introduced to back in college, and then kind of understanding the practice. You know, what does it mean to practice in terms of a democratic or progressive type of education. And so if I go back, I actually went to a very progressive school as a young person. I grew up in Europe and went to a school that was a British school, but it was founded on a group called Summerhill. And if any of you are familiar with progressive education, obviously the version in the United States was Dewey and the idea of Paulo Freire. And okay. I'm just checking, the screen was showing the next slide. Okay, all right, so thank you for that, Elizabeth, changing it. I'm sorry about that. I am new to this, so hopefully we're not sharing the next slide. So thinking about, you know, we all say education is the answer. Education is the answer. A lot of times my students say education, but I always like to ask, well, what kind of education, right? A lot of education is very oppressive. It's very racist. It's very sexist. It kind of crushes student creativity or self-confidence. And so I think it's really important when we talk about education that we're very clear about the type of education and who are the educators that we admire and what makes their perspective different. Those of you who may have heard of Paulo Freire and his pedagogy of the oppressed, that his work greatly influenced Bell Hooks, who greatly influenced me. Paulo Freire, no doubt, was greatly influenced by John Dewey, and kind of thinking about education as the practice of freedom. A quote from Bell Hooks that I love, right? That we educate to help people become their best selves, rather than in this picture. Please explain the slide. Okay, so that would be Lizeth, because this is her screen. Lizeth, can you expand the slide to fill more of the screen and make it larger?
So that's actually going to depend on each person's device.
Okay.
So if you are in side-by-side mode, just go ahead and click that middle column. It has 2 lines, and then you can go ahead and drag it out as large as you'd like.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, so a lot of college education, even though this little black and white picture of kids in rows, a lot of college education is that. That's not what I got at Douglas, thank goodness. What I got was sitting in circle, students leading, discussion, students acting as leaders in terms of intellectually and not just the content. This picture of kids sitting around a table. And so thinking about how we teach as creating the reality that we are seeking. All right, if I can go to the next slide. So you have, it's your screen, right? So should I just say next slide, or do I?
Next slide works for me. I did give you remote control, so you can, you should be able to.
So how, because my changing slide hasn't changed the shared screen.
Okay, I will get it, no worries.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, it just, okay. So given my educational background, there were certain intellectual ideas and theories that really resonated with me. I was also, along with Bell Hooks, introduced to Angela Davis, Women, Race, and Class, in my journey as an undergrad, which also changed how I viewed, having grown up in Europe, my white identity, my middle class identity. I was not well schooled in understanding the intersection of race or gender. And so later getting into Angela Davis's work has kept me true to a more complex analysis, and has shaped everything that I have done since then. But then as a sociologist, kind of trying to bring that to this larger idea of the full social construction of reality. And that's really become my perspective, that as humans, we create these realities. So whether that reality is gender, whether that reality is race, whether that reality is what does it mean to live a good life, and trying to get people and my students, and also in my work, to see that when we do social justice work, we are not only creating something that doesn't exist, but we are changing the construction of reality, right? We are inviting people to think about who they are or how society should be in a very different way. And so recognizing that opens up incredible amounts of doors and windows for possibility, right? That this society that we have has been created by us, that we collectively create these realities, and the more we give them power, the more they seem real. And so sociology gave me this connection to be able to recognize that if I'm creating my own reality, then I can shift it. And I can shift it collectively and commit to a different version of reality, kind of like the Gandhi saying, right? You know, be the change you want to see, and realizing that that exists on an entire social structure. Another key idea, if any of you've taken sociology, maybe you've been introduced to the sociological imagination, C. Wright Mills, the idea that as individuals in this culture, we tend to think about, you know, I've got personal troubles. I'm sure we all have personal troubles, right? But then recognizing that those troubles are actually linked to social issues. Every one of your personal troubles is linked to a structural issue that has this macro power over how you interpret your personal trouble. And so in many ways, the sociological imagination, kind of like as Bell Hooks was saying, sort of education as a practice of freedom, the sociological imagination is very liberating because it makes you realize that you did not create these issues that you are struggling with, that they are part of these larger systems. And part of how you liberate yourself is to recognize that you are not to blame, right? In our society, we like to sort of blame the individual, blame poor people, blame racism on, you know, whether it's individuals or even on the person who is the victim of it, blame women for their oppression. And the sociological imagination, along with the social construction of reality, helps us see these as larger patterns, again, that can be changed and do change, right? And are changed by individuals writing books, again, like Angela Davis. Dorothy Smith, a white sociologist from Canada, who recognized that also the issue of positionality, of being in a socially constructed world. How does it feel to be in it? And then for Dorothy Smith, race was not an issue because obviously she is white if we look at the image, and then recognizing how all of these sociologists who were not identifying with the issue of race, then we bring in the work of Angela Davis, and later, as I'll talk about, the work of Kimberly Crenshaw and the work of Patricia Hill Collins, and those ideas shaping how I came to understand society. Okay, next slide. And it says you can control it. Okay. So again, going back to my days at Douglas, one of the most significant things was the anti-apartheid movement. And I was happy to be able to find this image. These are students actually on Douglas campus in 1985. I transferred to Douglas in 1985 and immediately got swept up in joining the anti-apartheid divestment. A friend of mine actually camped on the Rutgers campus outside of the student center almost for an entire year. And it was an introduction that students and collective action can have an effect. Rutgers did end up divesting. It cut its financial ties with South African businesses or businesses that were doing business in South Africa. And so that really introduced me to the power of collective action. Also, while I was a college student, which is sort of unusual, I became a born-again Christian. I am no longer a born-again Christian, which is a whole other story. But what I got left with was the commitment to social justice, was the gospel of truth in the sense of equity, fight for the poor, fight for the oppressed, service, and really put others first in this kind of very bare roots gospel notion. Later on, also, I came out as a lesbian, and obviously there were some conflicts there. But you know, in terms of how we look at our stories and what has shaped our commitments. So a lot of my introduction to service led me to serving in the Peace Corps. I ended up teaching English in Cameroon. And one of the things that struck me, and obviously one could spend a lot of time sort of deconstructing sort of the white savior issue, going to Africa, the notion that developing countries, that we should make them like us, even that term that they are developing, somehow they are behind. All of that has changed in my mind. But when I went there, what I was most struck with was that I had nothing to teach them, in that sense that the rich cultural relationship to the land, to identity, and really, I can't say I regretted going because it changed my life, but certainly when I came back and went to Teachers College, I committed myself to trying to understand the damage that colonialism had done and what it is about Western culture that makes us think that we have the answers. Because most of my students in Cameroon were much more aware of who they were than I was. Yes, they were poor in terms of materials, goods, but they were not poor in terms of their self-esteem, in terms of their identity, in terms of their culture. And so my legacy from the Peace Corps was really recognizing that we were the problem. It wasn't that we were going to go and help others. It's that I was going to commit to trying to figure out why we thought everybody should be like us. And so I ended up at Teachers College as an educator. I did a master's in international educational development. And again, that idea that everybody should have Western style education, or everybody should have Western style capitalism, or that everybody should be, it began unraveling for me. And my journey took me to becoming a sociologist. Before I ended up at Binghamton, I had actually not really taken a sociology course. But once I sort of got my teeth into sociology, I realized that that would give me the answers that I was looking for. That would enable me to understand, you know, how colonialism, how racism within the West came to be so embedded in our culture. And I'm still unpacking it, as we'll see. So let me see, how do I do the next one? Next one, thank you. I still can't figure out how to do the next one. So from that, in graduate school, I was introduced to the concept of intersectionality. Going back to Angela Davis, intersectionality builds on her work, and Kimberly Crenshaw coming out of legal studies and recognizing that race, class, and gender totally are inseparable. You can add ability, you can add sexuality, you can add location, and that they transform each other. And this is the key. And this is the major insight that she contributed. You're not a woman and white. You are inseparable. You are not white, gay, a woman. That these are inseparable, and that these identities are in all aspects of our culture and all aspects of human society, that human societies create these identities, again, going back to social construction. They build, they make them real, they organize laws, they create behaviors, they become social norms. And so, as this quote from Crenshaw says, it was like a prism to bring light to dynamics within discrimination law that weren't being appreciated by the courts. And so she found that you couldn't actually make a lawsuit in terms of discrimination of race and gender. You had to pick. And she's like, well, these are not separate. How can I possibly pick? I know the light on my face is kind of lined, but that's the sun, and I'm sorry about that, but hopefully it's kind of interesting. Makes me look interesting. How's that? And then, you know, recognizing that intersectionality was never supposed to just be an intellectual tool. It's never supposed to be, oh, that's a great theory, let's just theorize, let's just theorize. This is about praxis. This is about how can we use intersectionality to enhance equity, freedom, justice, and practice it. And so my work later on with the kitchen is like, well, how do you apply this? How do you live this? Same thing, Patricia Hook Collins has also taken up the lens of intersectionality, and her work has greatly influenced me, but also her book on intellectual activism, recognizing that as intellectuals, we, I think, have a duty to take what we know and move it out of the ivory tower, move it out of the classroom, and bring it into the world and practice it and make it available, make it comprehensible, make it useful, and not use it as a way to distinguish ourselves or to put ourselves on a pedestal. And so for Collins, I love this idea of challenging power structures from within. Working the cracks within the system requires learning to speak multiple languages of power convincingly. And so, you know, part of my legacy in academia has been, you know, working the cracks and trying to learn from people who have gone before, learning from these ideas and unpacking my own whiteness, my own racist ideology growing up as a white young person in the 1960s and 70s, and really being humble that I don't know. I need to be kind of re-educated about how to do social justice work that speaks to all of these identities. Another key thought that has greatly shaped me, let's go on, is the concept of just sustainability. So I'm sure you've all heard the word sustainability. It's probably one of the most overused words. And it gets used in a way that generally talks about economics. But Julian Agyeman, who's at Tufts University and who I have published with, I have the book that I will get to in a minute is coming out under one of his series. He and Robert Bullard, who is seen as the father of environmental justice, another sociologist, came up with the idea that you can't just talk about sustainability. You have to have a concept of justice, and you have to recognize that this notion of justice isn't just about, you know, one issue over here, but not over there, that it has this, again, to bring the intersectional, it has to be just from the perspective of of race, or from the perspective of gender, or from the perspective of class, and from the perspective of sexuality, or from the perspective of somebody in a different country. And so you start to realize that you bring all these ideas together and you see how complex trying to create justice is, and especially authentically. So a nice quote from Aguiman is this definition of just sustainability: the need to ensure a better quality of life for all now and into the future in a just and equitable manner, whilst living within the limits of supporting ecosystems. So again, you know, what's just for rich people might not be just for low-income people. And so this is the challenge that we face as a species, is to recognize that we have to have justice if we're going to have sustainability. We have to address gender inequality, racial inequality, sexual identity inequality to have sustainability. Sustainability is actually not about solar panels or windmills. When my students take my Sustainable Societies class, I think a lot of them imagine that we're going to focus on solar panels and things like that. And as we go on our journey, they start to understand that this is actually about an entire cultural shift. And this is much harder, right? The technology, I like to say to my students, we're pretty good at this, right? We're very clever when it comes to coming up with technology. We're not so good when it comes to living equitably, or addressing racism, or addressing sexism. We're finding those much harder. And so we want to keep pretending that the answer is technological, but it is not. So these are the definitions of just sustainability. If you haven't heard of it and you find it interesting, I definitely recommend checking it out. And keep that in mind, that justice has to be a central part of any form of sustainability. Okay, next slide. Great. Another book, I don't know if any of you have ever read Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. If you haven't, greatly recommend it. One of the things that he introduced me to, again, is this idea that culture is actually story. So going back to Isabel Allende, or to the sociological imagination, the idea that we all have stories, but then that society is a story, and society tells itself a story. You know, we are the people from the sky, we are the people from the mountains, we are the people, you know, of the goddess, we are the people. And so culture is a way that we tell ourselves a story, and our particular culture at this particular time, 2021, is telling a story that is self-destructive. It is a story that tells us we own the planet, that we are separate from the planet, that the planet is somehow less than. You often see pictures of sort of people holding the planet, particularly white people holding the planet, they're going to save it. Very much the narrative of sort of the colonial, we're going to rescue the underdeveloped countries, or we're going to save the damsel in distress. And so Daniel Quinn made me realize that as a culture, we are telling a story, but not all cultures tell this story, and that not all humans took up farming. And this is one of the key things when I teach about climate change, or when I teach about sustainability, that farming changed our relationship to the natural world. Farming developed in the Fertile Crescent about 10,000 years ago. It also developed in the Americas in small scale. A lot of Native Americans did a little bit of farming and a little bit of hunter-gathering and some hunting and some this and that. But farming, where it became the dominant narrative and where it became a part of an identity, sort of emerged out of Egypt and spread across Eurasia, and became linked with population growth, became linked with military, became linked, because once you start farming, you have a surplus. Hunter-gatherers did not have a surplus, so they had more equitable. And it's important to recognize there are still hunter-gatherers in the world. They still live in a way that we would say, oh, primitive, backward, and we try to pretend that they're not actually related to us, but they are very much our history, in fact, all humans were hunter-gatherers for way, way longer than we have been farmers. Okay, continue. And again, I apologize about the light, but hopefully it's changing. So one of the things that I learned from that and that lens, and this is how I teach my climate change and my sustainable societies class and my sociology of food class, is to recognize that the social ecological crisis, climate change, environmental destruction, also systemic racism, genocide of Native Americans, rampant patriarchy, things like that, are all rooted in a similar cultural narrative, right? So if we recognize how this plays out and that they are cultural, not biological. So when we say humans are causing climate change, even the word anthropogenic climate change, that implies that everybody is involved. The work I'm doing, okay, yeah, houselessness rather than homeless. I just saw that in the chat. We can talk about that. But whenever we say all humans are destroying the planet, we erase cultures around the world that for thousands and thousands of years have lived sustainably. We erase the Inuit, we erase people in the Marshall Islands, we erase people indigenous in the Amazon. And so this is a key thing, is to realize that alienation from the natural world, from our bodies, from self and others, these are cultural. That most indigenous people would not say, I am separate from the environment. They would not see themselves as dominant over the environment. They would not see the environment as private property, that we own it and it belongs to us. We get to do what we want. And so recognizing the subsequent racism, sexisms, classisms, or LGBTQ oppressions, that these are cultural, and that the supremacy has its roots in aspects of our culture, in our aspects of our religion, aspects of our narrative, aspects of our story. Manifest Destiny is a story that God gave white people, the Americans, to conquer. And often our stories are used to legitimize our inequalities, right? They justify them and they help make them seem real. Right? They make them seem like you can't change them, which is exactly what those in power would like, right? That you cannot dismantle capitalism, you cannot dismantle racism, you cannot, because they're real and therefore they're solid. But fortunately, we have, tools to help us. We have intersectionality, we have the social construction of reality, we have just sustainabilities, and these theoretical lenses help us see, wait a minute, these are cultural and therefore the solutions are also cultural. And so the industrial food system, which includes everything from deforestation, water pollution, soil erosion, food waste, inhumane treatment of animals, workers, the whole immigration issue around the southern border. It's all an illusion that doesn't look at the food system. Factory farming, I mean, we need illegal immigrants for our industrial food system to run. So the whole idea of blocking illegal immigration is part of the narrative of supremacy, right? All the while using people in very exploitative ways. Next slide. Just checking the time. Okay, so let's fast forward to about 10 years ago. My wife and I met and got married 11 years ago. We got very involved in the Willimantic Food Co-op where she had been working. I live, and now she lives, in Willimantic, which is in the eastern corner of Connecticut. It was once a very big cotton mill town. Cotton coming from the South, from slavery, was brought to New England and turned into thread or turned into material. And the mills were incredibly profitable. Willimantic has some enormous Victorian houses, lots of social inequality. The mills brought in French Canadians, Greeks, Polish. The last group to immigrate to work in the mills were Puerto Ricans. Then the mills closed in the 80s, and basically Willimantic went completely into poverty. We are a tiny town. We're about 20,000, but we are the third poorest town in Connecticut after Bridgeport and Hartford. We like to say we're a small town with big city problems. And we are out of 8 counties in Connecticut, we are the 8th poorest county. It's also interesting, you know, Windham voted for Trump, Windham County, along with the richest county, which was Kent. So it's kind of interesting to look at Republican, Democrat, just kind of making ideas around how poverty and wealth shape our political views. So in this town, we are also surrounded by small farms. Eastern Connecticut is referred to as the last Green Valley. It is very rural. So you have this small little center of a town, and actually Willimantic doesn't really exist. So New England jurisdiction is very strange. They have towns that aren't really in existence. It's actually Windham, and then Windham is also the county. But Willimantic became this very impoverished center surrounded by small farms, many of them organic, many of them former Yukon people, many of them associated with the co-op. And in this context, out of the co-op, we tried to think of, well, what could be a way of addressing some of these issues? Small farms can't get their value, like you grow a tomato on an organic farm, you can't get very much for it, but if you turn it into sauce, you can get more. Food waste, another problem. Labor issues, another problem. Unemployment in Windham and Willimantic, another problem. And so we came out with the idea of creating a kitchen. Next slide. So it became known as the commercially licensed cooperative kitchen. So it was a good idea. Everybody's like, this is a great idea. This is a great idea. Let's make a kitchen. We can incubate small businesses. We can help address inequality for underground businesses. There's a lot of Latino immigrants from Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, with food businesses that are done kind of in their basements or in their houses. So it was like, okay, can we create a commercially licensed kitchen that would be a nonprofit where people could afford to incubate a business or get a food truck? Could we have health and nutritional classes? Could we have community gardens? Could we have cultural events like a salsa festival where we'd invite Mexican dancing and traditional Mexican mariachis? Could we have a coquito festival that would speak to Puerto Rican heritage? Could we have a multicultural Earth Day? Could we do a mural to honor the indigenous Mohegans and the Machitocket Pequots? Could we, have Nepali food cooking? Could we invite Malik Yakini from Detroit, who is a leading urban farmer there? Could we make a kitchen where Maria de Los Angeles, who was cooking in her living room for 14 years, could finally become legal and have insurance and have a food cart? Could we get kids involved and help them grow and then process their food? Could we have a small hot sauce business? And so the answer was yes, but it took an incredible long time and a lot of cooperative input. And all of this became what is Click. And then I started to write a book about it. And the question for the book became, is this an example of just sustainabilities? And if so, how so? And if so, how have we addressed issues of intersectionality? So just kind of getting to the end of my talk, and then hopefully we can have discussion and questions. My book is coming out this year. It took me a couple of years to write. One of the reasons it took so long was because I was the president of Click, or board president, and trying to have a job, a full-time teaching at UConn, run a nonprofit, and write a book was kind of challenging. Through a series of synchronicities, I was able to step down and we were able to get some funding for an executive director. But the basic idea for the book is to ask this question of, well, what is justice, right? We like to use that word. We like to say, you know, for justice for all. But what does it actually look like on a day-to-day level? What would it look like to run an organization? You know, it looks like that is a commitment of the AADC. You know, how do we do this? What is sustainability? And then, you know, what is just sustainability? And then who decides, right? Who gets to say, oh yes, this organization is just, or this organization isn't just? And what is their positionality, right? It's very easy if you have white privilege to say, oh, America is just, right? But if you don't have white privilege, or if you don't have class privilege, or you don't have gender privilege, is America just? Or is your town just? Or is your family just? Or is your marriage just, right? And so these were questions that I posed to myself as I wrote the book. And obviously the book is my story. I'm very clear that it's from my positionality, it's from my memory. And, but at the same time, using my sociological imagination, using intersectionality, using social constructionism, I try to tell a story that I think is fair and representative of what we did. And so the micro questions were, you know, has Click achieved just sustainability? And if so, for whom or who decides? The other question was, how does an organization like Click become real? So under social constructionism, the way things become real is they become institutionalized. And they take on a life of their own. They get a logo, they get a building, they get, you know, and people start to talk about Click as a real place. But in the book, I use the story of the Velveteen Rabbit because I love that story. And part of what makes something real is love, right? Where people are committed to it, and people, you know, I've met students who tell me about Click. Have you heard of this great place called Click? And that always makes me laugh. And I'm like, yeah, no, that's cool. How did you, you know, and then they say, well, da 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 da. And I was like, actually, my wife and I, you know, started that. And they, you know, and then they get all excited. So it's sort of fun when something becomes real. And then, you know, has Click become real to a diverse community base? Or has it only become real to people who are at the co-op? Has it only become real to, you know, middle-class white foodies? Or is it real to Maria de Los Angeles? Is it real to other aspects of our community? And then also, you know, how do nonprofits sustain themselves financially while also being actively committed to social justice? And those aren't necessarily oppositional, but they do have challenges. I can tell you that, especially when, you know, money is often linked to other people's values. And that's been one of our struggles, to try to stay afloat and stay affordable, and have classes that are free, have scholarships for people, have Serve Safe that's in Spanish, have activities for the community, but also still be able to pay the mortgage. And then something that we're looking at more recently is how, you know, the board or staff or members, how do you address your personal racism or sexism or homophobia or biases, and how do you manifest that in daily operations as a form of critical praxis? And, you know, none of this is ever complete. You just, you know, you kind of keep evaluating and reflecting and evaluating and reflecting. And so at the end of my book, I don't say we have achieved it, but I say that we, you know, we're in process. We're in process. And I think we can all say that, right? We're a work in process rather than we have ever arrived. And so I think I'm kind of at the end, and I've seen people posting questions in the chat, and I would love to discuss anything that people want to talk about. I think my last slide is kind of a thank you. So Elizabeth, if you could just give me, oh no, actually the last slide is one of my inspiring quotes. So one of the things to remember, all of you, and I'm sure, you know, there are many activists that are listening right now, is the social change is slow, especially when we're changing our cultural identities. We're trying to change how we've been taught to think, kind of rewiring our brains. And so this quote from Reinhold Niebuhr, an American theologist and writer and thinker, particularly around World War II, and I love this quote. So he says, "Nothing that is worth doing can be achieved in our lifetime. Therefore, we must be saved by hope." Again, I don't think of Click, even if Click fails, if it closes tomorrow, it won't be a failure because it'll manifest into something else. Nothing which is true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history. Therefore, we must be saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone. Therefore, we must be saved by love. I never would claim that I did Click by myself. It's hundreds of people over 12 years have contributed to this project. And then no virtuous act is quite as virtuous from the standpoint of our friend or foe as it is from our standpoint. Therefore, we must be saved by the final form of love, which is forgiveness. And so again, humility, recognizing that positionality, that intersection. I might think that I'm doing something really virtuous and somebody will look at me from their perspective and say, not so much. So I think it's a beautiful quote to kind of remind us and keep us humble.